What's up, guys? This is Chris here, and today we're going to be talking about a topic that hopefully is informative, hopefully doesn't make too many people angry, but I'm going to say kind of how I feel about this subject. Today we're going to be talking about 20 gauge for self-defense. I get this question a lot. I've got a good bit of 20 gauge experience. I've got a good bit of 20 gauge shotguns. I also have a good bit of 12 gauge shotguns. So we're going to talk about the 20 gauge for self-defense, home defense mostly, but for self-defense use, not for like hunting and stuff like that. And we're not just going to talk about the 20 gauge, we're going to talk about it in relation to not only the 12 gauge, but to 5.56 guns and 9mm guns as well. It's going to give you kind of an overall pros and cons of what I think of the caliber and the platform for self-defense. Now, to start off, I'm not the absolute expert at this, but I do have a lot of experience in this, and I have put a lot of thought into this. I might miss some things, and if I do, please let me know in the comment section below. Before we get started, I do want to mention my Patreon supporters. Thank you guys very much. A lot of the guns and ammunition that you'll see on this video was brought to you by my Patreon supporters. It helps us stay non-biased. We appreciate that very much. We try to be the most honest gun channel on the internet, and you help us out with that. If you want to support the channel, all you got to do is go to the link in the description and sign up. Also, you can use YouTube Super Thanks. It buys guns and ammo either way. I also want to mention a local shelter in Ames, Iowa. It's the YSS. It could really use your help, so please get on that link and donate to those kids. And I do want to mention the sponsor of the video, the Sonoran Desert Institute. They are one of our favorite sponsors because I do believe that firearms education and getting a job in firearms technology is not only a great way to live your life, it's a great way to help out other people in the community that you like, but it's also a fun job that you can get a lot of joy out and make a good bit of money as well. We would also love if you became a gunsmith because, like I said, we live in rural Iowa. Gunsmiths are hard to come by, and I don't like doing shit myself all the time. So I'd really appreciate if you'd join the Sonoran Desert Institute, move in my area, and gunsmith for me. All right, so now we're going to go over some of the pros and cons of what I would consider the 20 gauge versus the 12 9mm 5.56, and I also want to go over some of the cons of just choosing a shotgun altogether for a home defense role, simply because I feel like if we don't mention that, a lot of stuff is going to be missed. So first off, let's go with some of the obvious ones. We'll take a look at the 20 gauge versus the 12 gauge. You got a few comparisons here. First up, I've got a 20 gauge Slug versus a 12 gauge Slug. Now, as you can see there, it's pretty obvious that the 12 gauge Slug is larger. They are the same length, at least these two are, but you can find different lengths as well. I believe these are 2 3/4, but you can find 3-inch, 3.5-inch with 12 gauge, and I'm pretty sure you can find 3-inch with 20 gauge, but I don't remember buying anything larger than that, but I'm sure they exist. Shotgun shells are very available, and the 20 gauge is very available, but the 12 gauge is probably the most available round as far as hunting in the United States. So there's a lot of options for this, a little bit less with this, but for the most part, these are still available. And honestly, as far as the 20 gauge go as a whole, you're probably gonna be able to find less ammunition in stores or even on your online shopping because there just are less available. Sometimes you might have to take a hit as far as what company or what size or what type of ammunition you want with the 20 gauge, whereas the 12 gauge, you're pretty much gonna be able to find your favorite company and type of ammunition and bullet weight at pretty much everywhere you go. So price between the two of them is also gonna be about even in my experience, even though you'd expect 20 gauge to be less because it is a little bit less lead and material. It's about the same in price. I see it go higher, I see it go lower, so I'm just going to call it a wash as far as that goes, but I'm sure you guys have different opinions depending on which geographical position you live in, because prices in Iowa are not the same as prices in California or Oregon or something like that. Now, the recoil is one of the biggest reasons why people will use 20 gauge over 12 gauge. Not only recoil, but size of firearm also. So you have to remember the 20 gauge is going to have about, if it was in the same platform, about 30% recoil, right? 30% less recoil than the 12 gauge because it has about 30% less power as far as muzzle energy from the actual barrel itself. 2100 to 1500 for the buckshot, and you're looking at about 2488 to about 1865 for slugs. That's a lot of freaking energy either way, which is why I always think it's so funny people talk about the 20 gauge being woefully underpowered. Yes, it's 30% less than buckshot, but it's also 4 times more 9mm, roughly, if not a little bit more, depending on your ammunition choice. So it's like getting hit with 4 to 6 9mm rounds every single time you pull the trigger. That's real good, even though it's still lighter in recoil and theoretically easier to shoot than the 12 gauge. So we do have a positive with the 20 gauge over the 12 as far as recoil mitigation. The downside, though, and the upside, depending on how you look at it, is 20 gauge shotguns are also lighter. So I'm going to give you an example here. This is a 20 gauge Remington 870, and it's kind of actually hard to find tactical models of 20 gauge. That's going to be another con of the 20 gauge, is that there just aren't as many guns available as far as like a tactical role. Most of the time you're looking for a tac shotgun, an 18-inch barrel with a good capacity, with maybe a capability to put a dot, or maybe a capability to put a flashlight, sling, etc. You're just gonna have less options available. You still have your Mossbergs and your Remingtons and all the usual shit, but they're just gonna be a little harder to find. They're also gonna be smaller, and they're generally gonna have less length of pull, and they're gonna be lighter, so they're gonna be easier to carry overall for a long period of time, no matter how strong you are. But length of pull for me on 20 gauge shotguns is certainly an issue. We have a lot of 20 gauge shotguns in the house because my wife likes to shoot 20 gauge, and I'm a little bit bigger guy, so length of pull is always a factor. Now, can you change the stock? Yes, but is it a pain in the ass? Also, yes. Now, because they are lighter, even though they have less recoil, sometimes it feels the same. And I know that sounds a little crazy, but if you're shooting 20 gauge, 30% less recoil at 30% less weight, feels about the same. Because if you look at this Mossberg 590, for example, and you can compare them, you can just see that the Mossberg, I don't know if you can, but you can see the Mossberg is a significantly larger and heavier gun. You're about 1.5 pounds heavier over here as opposed to here. Easier to carry, easier to manage the recoil of the 12 gauge. So it really depends on what you're looking for, but usually smaller stature shooters are gonna do much better with the 20 gauge. And now if you wanna lower recoil even more and you don't wanna worry about caliber, keep in mind that semi-automatics generally have a lot less recoil than a pump gun does, simply because they have a recoil mitigating system in it built in already. Gas guns are generally even less recoil than something like an inertia system or a pump shotgun. Now, one of the things I want to talk about with slugs, because I've done an enormous amount of deer hunting with 20 gauge. 20 gauge was my first shotgun, and I had it for 5 years before I got a 12 gauge. Actually, I got a 16 gauge, then I got a 12 gauge. And I gotta say, 20 gauge kills them dead. I mean, a 20 gauge slug, I very rarely ever had to shoot twice. I don't know if I ever had to shoot a deer a second time with a 20 gauge slug. And some of those shots were about 100 yards. I don't know if you're aware of 20 gauge slug ballistics, but in my personal opinion, I would prefer to shoot longer range with a 20 gauge over a 12 gauge simply because of the drop, and I feel like the ballistics on a 20 gauge with a rifled slug barrel are a little bit better. I know people that have had easy hits out to 150 yards with a red dot or a magnified optic with a rifled slug barrel, and all those guys usually go 20. I know it goes back and forth. People go to 20 gauge for a little while, then 12 gauge gets hot. But in my opinion, if you're looking for long range slug accuracy, 20 gauge certainly ain't bad. It's on par or better than 12 in my personal opinion. Now we'll get into a little bit of penetration, and in my experience, slugs and buckshot, 12 gauge does penetrate maybe a little bit more, but you're certainly going to be more than capable of getting that 12 to 16 inches that you're looking for a self-defense distance in a 20 gauge shotgun. If you're worried about the power issue between a 20 gauge shotgun and a 12 gauge, I don't think it's going to make any difference within 5 yards, to be completely honest with you. Shotguns open up about the same at that distance as well. The pattern difference in a buckshot load at 7 yards is about 5 inches of spread, and with a 12 gauge, in my experience, it's about 5 to 6 inches as well. So you get the same spread, and in my experience, delivery of energy on target. As far as like wound lethality, wound capability, yes, you're gonna get more with 12 gauge, but how much do you need? You know, 20 gauge is already gonna put quite a freaking hole in them and splatter quite a lot of stuff on the other side. So it just really depends on what you feel comfortable with. But in my opinion, if you like the 20 gauge for a hunting gun and you wanted it for self-defense, as far as the power goes, I think that you're more than good. For me personally, you have to imagine that you're dumping 4 to 5 times what a handgun is as far as like intermediate. So you're getting quite a punch out of that guy, and you're going to be able to shoot relatively quickly as well with a 20 gauge, especially something like a semi-auto. Boom, 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 boom is certainly possible, and he wouldn't like that. Now that I rattled off a whole bunch of information about 12 and 20 here real quick, I kind of wanted to go over what I think, or at least my opinion, of this shotgun for self-defense. Now, deciding between 12 gauge and 20 gauge is one thing. Deciding between semi-automatic and pump is another thing, right? So you got to consider that the semi-automatic shotguns generally, it's not a video about semi-auto versus pump, but generally semi-autos have less recoil, they're slightly less reliable, and they generally use a slightly less wide variation of ammunition because the ammunition powers the mechanism to actually run the action, whereas with a pump gun you do it yourself. So you can use light loads, heavy loads, whatever with a pump gun, and then with a semi-automatic you kind of have to find what the gun likes. So keep that in mind. The other issue with the platform is that either 12 or 20 both use plastic shells, right? And if you keep it loaded in your gun for a long period of time, not always, but it can cause malfunctions, especially with the shells deforming and things like that, especially if you use it in a magazine with like a Sega 12 or something like that. Now, I've seen people say they don't, I've seen people say they do, but since I've seen it with my own eyes, I'm gonna go with they do. Shotguns give you a higher hit probability than something like a rifle? Yes, they absolutely do. If you're shooting at 5 to 7 yards, you're gonna get a 5 to 6 inch group, which is gonna help that hit probability at vital organs. I super agree with that. The one issue I have with that though, is what if your wife is taken hostage? What if they're holding your kid? What if they have something behind them that you can't hit and you have to have that precise shot? Because up close, in moving, precise shots do happen, right? If you look at active self-protection, if you look at any sort of home defense video or self-defense video, precise shots up close with a bunch of people running around happen, and they even happen inside houses and structures. So that's one of the reasons why I often, and in my personal experience, err toward the rifle. Just because if I gotta make that shot right there, I can with a rifle. I know where the round's going. Whereas with a shotgun, sometimes you not only get a 5 or 6 inch spread, but you get one over here, you get one up here. I personally don't like those flyers when my family's at risk, but that's up to you. And if that works for you and you're not worried about that situation, then by all means, definitely use a shotgun. I'm not saying it's not gonna work. They work now just as well as they worked 150 years ago. In my experience, shotguns not only can deform the shell inside the gun if you leave it for a long period of time, but shotguns are also not traditionally drop safe. So if you keep the gun loaded with one in the chamber, they actually can fire if you drop them. So that's one thing to be aware of. I would keep it probably like cruiser ready. If I was running a pump, what I would do is keep the magazine tube loaded, and I would keep the tube empty, and I would just rack the round in when I needed it. Now, is that sound gonna scare the intruder? Probably not, but the barrel and the barrel flash probably will, so either way. I think that it is a little bit less reliable just because of user-induced errors. Now, if you get a lot of new people on the range and you give them an AR and they load the magazine up and they rack the round, eventually they know how to do it. Whereas if you put them on the range with 100 rounds of 20 gauge with a pump, they're gonna short stroke. Ram it. You got it stuck?
Ugh, this is not for me. This is why I choose ARs.
So it's something you have to be aware of, and it's something that you have to know the battery of arms to shotgun. You have to know that the tang safety is on the top. You have to know that the crossbolt safety is on the bottom. They don't have the same like signature controls that maybe an AR does. You have to know how to run the slide, or you have to know how to run the semi-auto. You don't have to break it down in case of malfunction, and you have to learn all the malfunction drills when it comes with a shotgun, which are going to be different than a rifle. So just keep in mind it's a different platform, and you're gonna have to learn new shit. Now, a lot of people make a big deal out of the limited capacity, and that's why you have to have rounds on the side of the gun. For me personally, I have rounds on the side of the gun, but it's probably most likely due to having a malfunction in the gun and me having to clear or just wanting to have extra rounds there. On average, statistically, in a self-defense situation, a home defense situation, I think it's like 1 to 2 rounds of a shotgun fired is the average. And the reason for that is because of how devastating they are. Shotguns are loud indoors, they're extremely intimidating because of the movie factor, where, you know, if you see somebody shoot somebody with a shotgun in the movie, they fly 30 feet back. By the way, if that was true, as far as physics go, you'd fly 30 feet the other way too, but that is what it is. That doesn't happen, but the good news is that the intimidation factor for sure is there with something like this 590. I mean, it just looks scary, and that's what you want. The downside to that is if you're in front of a jury, and I don't like that, but generally classicer looking guns might help you there, might not. Personally, I'm worried about the moment, and I want the guy out of my house, so if the heat shield and the nice scary gun does it, I'm good with that. Now finally, as far as shotgun goes, 12 gauge and 20 gauge can both over penetrate, so be aware of that. I hate the argument that I'm trying to find a round that doesn't over penetrate, because basically what you're trying to do is find a shitty round. What you're trying to do is find one that is insufficient for self-defense, in my personal opinion. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but you can pick particular rounds for particular choices. And if you're super worried about shooting and over-penetrating, you can pick frangible ammunition, you can pick hollow point ammunition, but for the most part, you have to understand that it's your house, you know the exits, you know the entryways, right? So you should have a plan in action about how to deal with those situations, not hopefully he doesn't come in here because I'm gonna shoot my neighbor's cat 3 apartments down the road. You know what I mean? Like, you have to understand that you need to know your lines of fire. If you know that this guy's coming in the door and Grandma Annie's behind that, get down on a knee and aim up. Right? If you know that there's somebody above you, then don't do that, right? Like, you control your angle of fire in which way you shoot, and that cannot be an absolute tool, but it can be an effective tool to deal with the over-penetration issue.
That's a whole ass tangent.
Sorry, so I'm getting crazy. But at the end of the day, this is just a giant rant about 20 gauge. Hopefully I gave you some information you didn't know before. If you want to see more like this, let me know in the comment section below. If you'd like to see like a gel test or something with a little bit of buckshot versus buckshot or deer slug versus deer slug, also let me know in the comment section below. I've been thinking about doing that as well. If you want to add to, if you want me to do a part 2, I can do that as well. Let me know. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Please help out your local homeless shelters, and remember to recycle. I'll check you later.
What was that again?
It was boom boom. I got a little crazy.
Boom,
I've had way too much fucking coffee
boom,
today.
boom, 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 boom.
They can
boom.
tell too.
I'll give you boom, 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 boom.
Wide margin.
Man, my sexual advances are not landing at all today.
Well, sometimes motherfuckers gotta work.